This podcast is brought to you by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. By the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve. And by Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. On this episode, we welcome Lisa Deam, an author and speaker who uses art of the Christian past to illuminate modern faith. Her writing won a Best of the Christian Press award from the Associated Church Press. We'll discuss her latest book, 3,000 Miles to Jesus.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be listening. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And we're glad we could intersect with you today on our 8th season and our 2nd episode. My name is Rob Henderson, and I serve as the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London.
Vicar 2 here is Kevin George from St. Aidan's Anglican Church in the northwest corner of London, Ontario. And look who's back, if it isn't somebody back with us.
Hello, my name is Ian. I am the producer and uploader of this podcast. Hope you're all doing okay out there.
Oh, my gosh.
It's good to have Ian back in the house.
Yeah, look at me
Do
go.
you even recognize him, Rob?
I think you've grown a couple inches since the last time I saw you. Yeah.
It's like it's got some sort of a glow about him. I think working for a living agrees with you.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Having money in the bank agrees with you. I'm sure
Yes.
that helps too. Yeah. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the 2nd episode of our 8th season. And today we're excited to welcome to the podcast author Lisa Deam. And Lisa is an author and a speaker who uses arts of the Christian past to illuminate modern faith. And she's got a book out, which is called 3,000 Miles to Jesus, Pilgrimage as a Way of Life for Spiritual Seekers. We'll have to do some math and see how many kilometers that is. We'll let you know in a few minutes. Did you do the math?
I did it.
Okay.
It's 4,828 kilometers.
Okay, good.
Ooh.
That's the Canadian
Really
version.
rolls
then.
off the tongue.
It's 4,828 kilometers to Jesus.
Okay. But anyway, 3,000 miles or kilometers. It's all about getting to Jesus. And we're going to talk to Lisa about that. It's a wonderful book that's certainly going to appeal to those of us who really do try to be intentional about life's sacred journey that we're on. And this is a great book for Lent too. We're going to talk more about that, but this is perfect for those of you looking to pick something up for Lent.
It is indeed. We want to begin today by acknowledging that the land upon which we record this podcast is the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapeawauk, and Attawandaron peoples. These lands are connected with the London, Township, and Sombra treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of this land and vital contributors of our society, and people with whom we long to walk with in faith towards the difficult path of reconciliation after truth-telling.
We are always thankful for our sponsors. We have some wonderful sponsors in the Vicar's Crossing that continue to support our work here, and we want to say hello to them and give them thanks. First, to A. Millard George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. And our thanks, as always, to Dave Mullen, and we give a big shout-out to everybody at A. Millard George today.
Amen to Dave and the people over at AMG. We're also grateful to Bishop Todd Townsend and the Diocese of Huron. The Diocese of Huron is a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, from Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and to serve. And of course, our parishes in this podcast are excited that we are a part of that important ministry in this diocese.
And last but certainly not least, we want to say a huge thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. and it took me a while to dust that one off a little bit. So shout out
Oh.
to them. Hey. And Trisha Lister was a wonderful human being.
He may have been away a while, folks, but he's come back on rhythm.
That's
I'm
right.
cooking it up.
That's right. It only took him 8 weeks to write that line, but it was a darn good one.
I feel
Stayed
like
awake.
I
Rocking
feel
back and
you
forth.
practice that all night.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but I feel, Rob, like we should ask Ian because he's not been on with us, and I know he's had some stuff cooking.
Mhm.
What's the latest musical stuff? You must have dropped some stuff since you've been on with us that people should go find.
Yeah.
So, yes and no. There is some
Okay.
very exciting things coming out soon. For example, I wrote an original song for a video game that will come out at some point
Ooh,
soon.
Cool.
Nice.
As well as all the background music for that game.
Wow.
As for my own stuff, I had some stuff planned and then realized that it wasn't me. It was just
Okay.
they were songs for the sake of writing songs rather than songs for the sake of me saying something. So I have restarted a couple of my own original songs that will be out soon. I'm very excited about
Good.
the songs that I am writing, but it's going to take a little bit longer.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And if people are looking for you, they got to look up Ian Asio, right?
Yes.
Is that how you say that? ASIO.
Yes.
You look for him on Spotify and iTunes. There's music on there that he's already done, which is truly incredible. So
Thank you. Yeah.
we love that you're back.
Thank you. It's
Yeah.
good to be back.
Great to
Yeah.
have
Like
you
a
back.
second home.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we're ready to welcome Lisa Deam into the podcast, talk about her book, and we're going to go on a little spiritual journey with some of the
Indeed.
mystics of the past and much, much more. Let's bring Lisa in.
All right. Let's go those 4,828 kilometers. Come on in, Lisa.
And here she is now. Lisa is joining us on the Vickers Crossing podcast to talk about her book at a perfect time, as we said, just about getting ready to start Lent here. We're getting into it. And Lisa, we're so glad to have you aboard today. How are you?
I'm good, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. It's good to have you here. You're in North Carolina, right?
I am pretty close
Yeah.
to Charlotte.
Okay. Okay.
I'm guessing, Rob, they don't have ice pellets there today.
Probably not.
Well, it's like a summer day today.
Oh,
Is it? Oh,
good
brother.
Lord.
Okay.
Now I'm disgusted. I'm
Booking my
disgusted
flight
already.
right after this. Yeah. Yeah.
We-
We're in the
we-
midst of winter big time today.
Yeah, and I don't mind snow, but I don't like this freezing drizzle. And I mean,
Yeah.
drizzle should be drizzle, not freezing drizzle.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
says the guy who came from Newfoundland who grew up with freezing drizzle. But anyway, what are you going to do? We're really glad that you could join us. As Rob said, it's a great book, a great time for us. I was really curious when I picked the book up and it said 3,000 miles to Jesus. If there was a version for the rest of the world that lives in metric, 4,828 kilometers to Jesus.
That's right.
That's what I wonder. You think we should get one of those out, Lisa? Can we do a reprint for Australia, Canada, the United
My publisher,
Kingdom?
I'm sure they'd be delighted.
It's not nearly as catchy.
Funny.
40, I mean, you could round it up. 4,800 kilometers to Jesus, I
It
guess.
doesn't
but-
have that. Doesn't just roll off the tongue quite as
No.
No, this is not the same. Not the same. But anyway, and it feels like more, even though it's not. But
Yes. Right.
Oh gosh, it's such a good book. I love reading it. Congratulations on it. I mean, I must imagine you're getting good praise everywhere from it. We've certainly recommended it to fellow sojourners in our parishes, to our colleagues. I wanted to start in the introduction. You write, this book is about traveling well, which I really like because I feel like traveling anymore, like there's no joy in traveling anymore. It feels like everything has been sucked right out of it. And just talking to a parishioner here this morning, actually, she had a big trip for Iona work that she does to Europe last week, and she's still aching from like physically aching from the trip, right? So it's like any journey we set off on now feels like a lot. You write in there that it's about traveling well, about learning to embrace a life of intentional pilgrimage. It is your hope, you write, that the historical wisdom collected here will help us live out our journeys, both large and small, with the sacred meaning and purpose they deserve. And I really like that, as those of us who are intentional about pilgrimage often talk about going all in, that it really is costly, right? It doesn't come cheap, and that life itself becomes the journey. You write about that. People live and breathe and walk their quest for the sacred. Can you say more about intentional pilgrimage and how these historical pilgrims that you write about in the book of the medieval saints can help us bravely set out on our own spiritual pilgrimages?
Sure. Well, I came across this topic when I was doing some research for my first book, which was on medieval maps. But it got me into pilgrimage journeys of the late Middle Ages And as I started learning more about the journeys, reading the stories, and then just looking at what a pilgrimage was like as a whole, especially pilgrimage to Jerusalem, I thought there was something about this sounds familiar. And I know that sounds a little strange. Let me tell you what I mean. Here were people trying to reach Jerusalem from, let's say, somewhere in Europe, to worship at the places where Jesus had, walked and taught and died and rose again. And they gave up a lot and took on a lot of risk to reach Jerusalem. And I kind of thought, isn't that sort of what we're all doing on our journey of faith today? We have a destination to which we're traveling, which scripture tells us is the heavenly Jerusalem. So just like the medieval pilgrims, we're trying to reach Jerusalem. And so these journeys kind of reminded me of our own walk of faith. And I thought that digging into them might give us some words that are honest, but also hopeful about our journey of faith. Because Kevin, as you mentioned, travel today is a mess, and journeys of faith are not always a walk in the park either. They're very challenging, and so there's no reason to try to deny that or to sugarcoat it. But these challenging aspects, how can medieval pilgrimage help us to understand those and to give us some comfort and hope in our journeys? And so that brings me back to the first part of your question. When I say intentional pilgrimage, I really mean to understand or have knowledge of and embrace our identity as pilgrims. So to know that, to embrace it, which is, after all, one of our biblical identities. And so
and I think I really like that, because I think sometimes that business of the intentionality, I think that for a lot of us who live in these sort of lectionary-based churches and ritual-based churches like the Anglican or Episcopalian Church, oftentimes we can get lost in rote or rhythm, and we lose the intentionality of what it means to sort of really be mindful of what's going on around us. And even in a physical sense, in terms of our worldly journeys, like you said, it's sometimes we don't have the wisdom to come back from these trips exhausted and stop and even name that it may be just a journey itself that's worn us out. And so I really think that business of taking time to actually know that we're headed somewhere is really so critically important. You write about that as well, about the business of having a destination, because how often do we hear nowadays, oh, the joy is in the journey, it's all about the ride, man. Enjoy the ride. It's, it doesn't matter where you're going as long as you've got a good ride. I feel like I'm on a Harley. But you write in the book, focusing on our destination sounds distinctly countercultural today, which I believe you're right. It is. Often when it comes to pilgrimage, we hear sayings like, it's the journey that matters, or the search is the meaning, man. You didn't put man in, I put that in. Yet this viewpoint will be unimaginable for medieval pilgrims. Sometimes we forget that historically a pilgrimage almost always had an end point. The pilgrim arrived, the goal was attained. The journey was completed. Yes, the act of travel might itself have been transformational, but it led pilgrims to a single destination, the way a well-shot arrow hits the mark. And you reference Jamie Smith in here too, James K. Smith, who we've also had on this podcast. But I was just thinking, how often do we hear this business about the journey being the real deal? And you point out that true freedom, if you want to know what freedom is not being on the road, but that freedom itself lies in walking the road that has been already blazed, in following in a way that we don't have to make ourselves, because somebody else has already paved it, or as you put it, has pulled the weeds already for us. And we come from a rich tradition of that, of pilgrims for millennia now who've walked the way. And it lies in knowing that someone is waiting at the end with a light, with the light left on, with a meal ready for us, that we're arriving somewhere, that really, really matters. We set out on these journeys with a destination in mind. So I wonder if you can say more about why remembering that is so truly important and why it matters so much.
Well, I totally agree with you that so often when we talk about our pilgrimage or our journey, and those are, of course, very common ways to think about our faith, the pilgrimage, the journey, or any kind of journey we might be going through, that we do here. It's not the destination, it's the journey. The meaning is in the journey. And of course, that is true to a large extent, because the journey is where our day-to-day life is lived, and where we're growing and learning and making mistakes. But as you point out, if we're going to use that metaphor, that we're on a pilgrimage of faith, if you do think about what a pilgrimage really is, at least historically, it was a journey, a sacred journey that led to a very specific destination. So a medieval pilgrim was always going to Jerusalem or to Santiago de Compostela, and reaching that destination was really the reason for setting out on the journey. Although the journey itself, of course, had a lot of meaning too. So it's kind of two sides of the same coin, that you have to have both. But if you think for a minute, in my book, I'm talking mostly about pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And if you think about Jerusalem as the destination, both for the medieval pilgrims and for us today who are journeying to the heavenly Jerusalem or to our little Jerusalems each day, I think that really highlights how important the destination is. I mean, Jerusalem, that tells us where we're headed in life, and it gives us a lot of hope. Like it gives the journey meaning and context, and lets us know that we're headed to this really glorious destination.
Yeah, and that's so telling, especially now, as I said, because we're just beginning. We're so glad that you could be here at this time of the year, because we're just beginning Lent as we record this and air this. And that Lent in itself has a destination at the end.
Right.
And it is, we're it's not just about going through the 40 days. It's about arriving and looking ahead to that destination of Easter.
I mean, in Lent, we engage in all kinds of practices maybe, but, in Lent, we're asked to follow Jesus all the way to the cross, to Jerusalem. Right. So that's Lent itself is a kind of pilgrimage to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
The 40 days matter. But we are reaching for a goal as well that gives it all meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, Kevin, you're off again.
Sorry, I know I was muted there. I was just going to add to that. Yeah, I mean, we enter into the 40 days, but we do so knowing that the destination is Easter.
Right.
We realize that we're journeying towards the resurrection, right? Anyway, Rob, sorry, go ahead, buddy.
No worries. No, yeah, well, that's perfect. So maybe we can even chat a little bit about that, because as we enter into Lent, maybe we can talk about this notion of, as we go through these 40 days, that we're about giving up, and we're about not holding on, including our very own lives. That walking with Jesus is a journey on which we are all in it, as it were. And you mentioned this in the book. I'd like to share just a short passage where you write that when Jesus said that a person must give up everything, he truly meant everything. For those of us on a spiritual pilgrimage, there is nothing that we can hold on to, and that includes our very life. In an interview about the Gospel of Mark, Eugene Peterson said, and this is really neat, the first half of the Gospel is Jesus showing people how to live. He's healing everybody, right? And then right in the middle, there's a shift, and he starts showing people how to die. Now that you've got a life, he says, I'm going to show you how to give it up. That's the spiritual life. It's learning how to die. And that spiritual path that we talk about requires so much of us. And yes, there are some days that we struggle to leave some of our baggage behind. And on those days, you, Lisa, encourage the reader to focus on a mantra, which is, I am pointing my feet in the right direction. I am taking the sure way. Can you share more with us today about, overcoming maybe the fear of giving up that comfort and control and those things that we so much want to hold on to?
Yeah, well, Lent is the season where a lot of us think about, if we don't actually, giving up things, and pilgrimage is a really good way to frame that and to think about giving up things. because, of course, one of the pilgrims' maxims, even today, is to travel light. Only take what you need, leave most of it behind, because if you're overburdened, that's just going to slow you down on your destination. So I hear a lot about that with modern pilgrims who are walking today. And, it's easy to talk about giving things up, and like what you just read about Eugene Peterson. I'm going to teach you how to die. It's giving up your life. So easy to talk about, but really sobering and kind of frightening to think about in a way. I think about medieval pilgrims who often, before going to Jerusalem and even maybe to Santiago de Compostela, wrote a will before they set off, with that particular pilgrimage in mind, because it was such a long and dangerous and risky journey that there was no guarantee of returning. And a good many of them really, in fact, did not return.
Did not.
But to take that pilgrimage to Jerusalem, it just, part of the deal was, whether you wrote a will or not, was to be ready, to know that you might have to give your life for that journey. And that always, it's a fascinating bit of history that, they wrote a will before heading off to Jerusalem, but it always makes me think about what I can give up for my faith, or what I'm willing to give up for my faith. First of all, what I'm called to give up, to take up the cross, to follow Jesus, to die with Jesus. So, can I do that? Am I willing to do that? For me, it's always an exercise in counting the costs of the faith.
And there's a great gift. There's a great gift to that too, in the giving up, because in anything we give up, it makes us reliant on something or someone else. And that's the thing about giving up, and that spiritual journey of all about this, writing a book about pilgrims, that there were times when they had to rely on others in order to meet that destination, and that was part of the giving up as well. And in a sense, we do that too when we give up during Lent. It's about being reliant on God, and the gifts that God might want to give us, that we might not have thought of. But anyway, you talk about some examples of people in your book about these pilgrimages, and want to talk a little bit about those. One of them is Friar Felix Fabry, who lived from 1441 to 1502. And he was a Swiss Dominican theologian who left vivid and detailed descriptions of his pilgrimages to Jerusalem. And he was a resourceful traveler, yet you write about even how he would feel the urge to want to turn back from the journey, right? And that staying the course is actually really hard work. And that speaks across the centuries to all of us who, the call to adventure comes, but it also comes with a healthy dose of trepidation. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about Felix and say more about how, we might stay the course and persevere on our pilgrimage roads.
Yeah. Well, some of the stories about the individual medieval pilgrims are so wonderful. And Felix Fabry is really a character, and also a really great spiritual companion, I think, to have on the road for us even. And one of the stories I really like about Felix, he wrote a book about his pilgrimage. So that this is how we know that. So he wrote in his book that no sooner had he set out from his hometown of Ulm in Germany, I think he'd gone maybe a few miles, that he was struck by this irresistible urge to turn back, because all of a sudden he was frightened of everything. He was frightened of crossing the sea. He just wanted to go back to what he knew and to what was comfortable, and that he would have turned back if he wouldn't have felt so ashamed, he said. And I know, Felix Fabry writes with a little bit of rhetorical flourish and flair. Yes. So maybe he's laying it on a little bit thick for us, but I think there's something in what he says. I hear, his call of wanting to turn back. This really experienced traveler who went to Jerusalem twice and barely gets out of town. And the cry of his heart is, I can't do this.
Right.
And, I think that we all probably know that feeling, that that feeling that we're not going to make it. We're not going to make it through this specific trial we're facing, or through this season of life, or even through the really slow, agonizingly slow process of growth and redemption. And so we know what Felix Fabry feels. And so of course we see in his story, and even in the example of the Egyptians, the Israelites whom Moses led out of Egypt, that it's common and normal to have that desire to go back to what is familiar, to fear that you're not going to make it. Just knowing that that's often a part of the journey, I think is helpful.
We experienced that just when we were kids. How many of us ran away?
Are we there yet?
got about a block away.
Yes,
went,
that's right.
I'm going back. I'm going back. This is too big a world.
I'm tired already.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even when we know what amazing things are awaiting us, for example, on our journey of faith, still, there can be that impulse to I just don't want to do it. I just can't do it. And one of the pieces of advice we get from the medieval pilgrims is through a spiritual pilgrim this time, not a physical pilgrim, Walter Hilton, who was a 14th century Augustinian canon and wrote a spiritual treatise that included a section on how we're all like pilgrims. And he said, you will be tempted to turn back. And he said, when this happens, repeat to yourself, I want to be in Jerusalem. And he says, if the feelings persist, say this. And he delivers a kind of saying or mantra that's really good for pilgrims. I am nothing. I have nothing. I desire nothing but the love of Jesus alone. And he repeats that 3 or 4 times in his passage, which is why in my book I refer to it as a kind of a mantra or a saying that we can sort of cling to. I desire nothing but the love of Jesus alone. And I think by that, Hilton means that when we have these temptations or fears that we're not going to be able to stay on our road, a saying like that just refocuses or recenters us on Jesus, which is the reason for our pilgrimage, and just reminds us why we're making the journey. So sometimes, a shift of focus. And, there are a number of mantras or sayings in the Christian tradition, and this is one that's little known.
That's a good one, yeah.
That I find really meaningful.
I have to say to you, yesterday, being Ash Wednesday, we're recording this on Thursday. For those of you listening on Monday, saying yesterday was Sunday, not Wednesday, but it was Wednesday yesterday. I promise. We were out and about here from St. Aidan's, and one of the things we did was we went to a local mission called the Arcade Street Mission and delivered some meals and imposed some ashes. And I took some time at tables, and I thought of you yesterday, Lisa, in having recently read your book, because I sat with one gentleman in particular. I just heard so much desperation yesterday. So many people, as I said, we were faced with freezing ice pellets yesterday. People have no place to sleep here in the city. There's a crisis in homelessness. And I sat with this one man in particular who said, I don't have anything. I am nothing. I just want God to love me. It was almost verbatim, it was like, and I raised what you had written actually and said, I don't know if this can become a mantra for you or not, because you feel so in despair about God at the moment, but you can remind yourself that even though you have nothing, the love of God may be all that's going to sustain you in this, and so I heard some real testimony there yesterday in a way. And I just thought your reminder of Hilton's words was so apropos for my time yesterday anyway.
Wow, that's really beautiful.
Yeah.
What a story.
You talk about And I guess we mentioned this before about the preparations that pilgrims had to do on their journey, and the things that they had to leave behind. You mentioned a will and all of the bringing provisions to prepare for the journey, and for what lies ahead. Yet, no matter how prepared we may think we are or seem, before any journey, at some point we can count on encountering the unknown territory, where, as you describe it in the book, quote, familiar landmarks dissolve in a haze, as in the open sea. Suddenly we can no longer see our way forward. We cannot even be sure that we are headed in the right direction. And Thomas Merton wrote, quote, "You'll never see anything very clearly in this life, but you can certainly grope your way towards God." And I thought that was a very interesting idea, sort of the open sea, and not really knowing if you're going forward or going even backwards or in even the right direction. And I wanted to know if you could tell us more about the facing the unknown and the counsel that we get from some of the exemplars of faith, like Merton.
Yeah. Well, I think that referencing the sea, like that you just mentioned, that comes from the chapter in my book, and the part of the pilgrim's journey in which they get on a boat in Jerusalem, not Jerusalem, in Venice, and then the boat that takes them across the sea to Jerusalem, first to Jaffa and then to Jerusalem. That's how the pilgrimage was pretty much done in the late Middle Ages. So at some point after a difficult journey to Venice, they get on a boat and head out into the sea, where there's often no landmarks. And for many of the pilgrims, this would have been the first time they had encountered anything like a sea. And so that evokes a time, maybe a time or a place that we don't have many landmarks. And I think it evokes for me the idea that we do have a destination. We talked about that, Jerusalem, but we're not there yet. And so much of our getting there is shrouded in a mist or a haze like that. And let's see, the quote you gave, I think, was actually from The Cloud of Unknowing, that said you can certainly grope towards God. But there is a beautiful prayer about this from Thomas Merton that many of you and those watching probably already know, that really evokes this. I'll just read just a little section of it.
No, read the prayer for us. Read the prayer. We'd love to hear the whole thing.
So Thomas Merton says, "My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end. Nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does, in fact, please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it." So that's a prayer I think many have clung to over the years. So when someone like Thomas Merton admits, "My Lord, I have no idea where."
No idea.
That sometimes it's just the very next step that we see, and that's all.
Right.
And one thing that from the the pilgrims that we're studying and other people from the past, one thing that helps, I think, is to remember this paradox that we're on our way to God, in a sense, like the pilgrims were journeying to Jerusalem. We're also on a journey to God, trying to get there. But God is also with us the entire way. So I love that paradox that he's also with us.
Right.
And St. Augustine wrote a little bit about this, really probably maybe thinking about pilgrimage. He wrote about a person trying to get to the one she desires across the sea. How is she going to get there? And Augustine says, well, the Lord Jesus built a raft for you to get there. And my thinking is, a raft does not sound very sturdy. But then Augustine goes on. I'll see if I can find it. For no one can cross the sea of this world unless carried over it on the cross of Christ.
Mm.
So the raft that
It's the
Augustine
cross.
is mentioning is the cross, and that is what we travel over this great sea of mist and unknowing over. So the fact that that we're never alone, which means that we can't truly get lost.
Mhm.
We'll reach our destination because we're traveling on the raft or the cross of Christ, even though I think many of us, feel that cloud of unknowing all around us. We travel, and that's where we have to have faith that Jesus is with us in
I
the journey.
think James K.A. Smith's book, On the Road with St. Augustine, writes about this very concept. So encourage people to pick that one up too, folks. That's another good one.
That is good.
Another one.
Yeah.
Let's talk maybe a bit more about that, because we're talking about, in a sense, exile, aren't we? In a lot of ways, and one of the stories you share in the book is the story of Pietro Cassola. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yep.
So was a Catholic canon, and he embarked on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. This was like 1494, but he found himself in a 2-week exile in the harbor at Jaffa. And before he and his fellow pilgrims finally were granted permission to enter into the Holy Land, and he went from being exile to light again when they were permitted to make that last leg of their journey. And you write a bit about this in the book, and you write, our own journeys might share similar shifts in identity, especially when we think about particular seasons of our spiritual life. Considering where we've been and where we stand now, we're likely to see periods of both exile and pilgrimage. In frustrating times, we may be tempted to shout exile. Perhaps it seems like all we do is wander without getting anywhere. Roadblocks are always in the way. In these times, we might pause and remember that the landscape in which we find ourselves is not just a place of exile. It is also the place of our pilgrimage. The barren earth we wander can become a verdant land in which we once again catch sight of the path that will lead us forward. And taking small steps and gazing toward a distant horizon, we make the journey from exile to pilgrim. Can you talk more about making that turn, from exile to pilgrim, of that reorienting of ourselves and turning our feet once again toward the Holy Land?
Yeah. Oh, exile and pilgrimage. That's a big theme of mine, something I always like to talk about and hit hard. It's kind of like the one about, in a pilgrimage, the journey is the meaning, like that we hear often.
Yeah.
But we also hear often today how we are in exile. And we hear a lot about the church today is in exile. I must have read 50 articles or essays about that in the past few years about the church in exile. And I think that's partly participating in the culture wars. But it also goes back much farther, all the way back to the beginning, the exile, because we are all, in a sense, exiles from Eden. So the true home that we were meant to live in is ours no longer. And we live our lives, in a kind of grief, a kind of missing the home and not being where we know we're supposed to be. But in this place that we're in exile, we're also, I think we've established, taking steps to Jerusalem, right? We're exiled and we're heading back to Jerusalem, like the new Eden, going back home. And if we are traveling to Jerusalem, well, that of course makes us pilgrims. So both are true. And at any one time, we are both exiles from Eden and pilgrims to Jerusalem. But I like to remind people often that we're not just exiles, because it's easy to dwell on that, because we do feel grief for our lost home, or for where the church is today, or for what's going on our lives. But the same landscape we walk is the landscape that we're walking to Jerusalem, so that with that acknowledgement of our identity and maybe some of the practices or meditations or mantras we're learning about in the book, we can remember that, well, I'm not just an exile, I'm also a pilgrim. And that, I think, gives the journey more hope, because we have the destination. We're not just an exile, never goes home, and pretty much wanders, maybe has a temporary home. But our identity, I feel strongly, is more that of a pilgrim, because we are on our way home, and we know that with Jesus we will reach that home in Jerusalem. So I think it's sometimes a matter of retraining our focus on Jerusalem, and remembering that the same place where we are now is where we can take a step.
That's right. There's an opportunity in every place, right? So it's almost like it's almost where that thing that we were talking about earlier that said it's not really the case, the business of it's not really the journey. But in a way, when we start talking about that business of taking those times of exile and finding something in them, we sort of do recapture that part of the journey as something which is more, as a piece of a larger whole, of a larger picture. Picking up on that from there, to talk about one of your chapters talks about worshiping with the enemy, and you point out in the book that Jerusalem sometimes came as a bit of a shock or a disappointment to some of the medieval travelers who, when they got there, found that things weren't exactly as they might have expected them. When pilgrims like William Way and Felix Fabry entered the gates of the city at the center of the world, they did not just meet Jesus. They also encountered those of other faiths. We all know there's been a long history, right? So whom they didn't consider to be, or they considered to be obstacles to their physical and spiritual journey. Writing about that in the book, I'll read this excerpt you share. The truth is that followers of Jesus will always pass through contested territory, always encounter conflict and enemies on the Jerusalem road. Along the way, we learn an important lesson. Our truest enemies are not in the landscape out there. They aren't people on different political or religious spectrums, or those of differing beliefs. They are likely not, in fact, people at all. For the spiritual pilgrims, the greatest foes are the infidels of our own heart, which is a turn of phrase. When I read it in your book, I've committed it to me. Infidels of our own heart. These enemies of the spiritual pilgrims sneak into all the nooks and crannies of our lives. They easily persuade our hearts to turn against us. All it takes is a memory, a destructive thought, or a glance at someone against whom we hold a grudge, and suddenly the sacred space of our inner terrain has become a dark and treacherous minefield. In the midst of the heart, the place where God dwells, we are denied true entrance by the enemy within. I thought this chapter of the book was incredibly important, particularly as somebody in this podcast as well. We do a lot of interfaith work, and I think sometimes the perceived, I've been saying for years now, the enemy of the church is not anything out there. It's not Islam, it's not Judaism, it's not Hinduism or Buddhism or atheism or anything else. It's our own propensity as an institution to allow those infidels of this institutional heart take hold of us and lay a hold of us. They can become quite bold, these enemies. And when you speak about them on a personal level in the book, you name a couple. You name them fear, which often whispers to us that the path is too dangerous. And the other one, of course, being shame, which saunters up and stands, you write, directly in the way. Shame, you say, is a liar most often rather than a truth teller, an enemy that tries to convince us that we are unworthy to make the passage toward and with the love of God. Can you share with us how do you keep focused? I mean, when with our listeners, I mean, I think that this is one of the biggest spiritual challenges. I think that over the years, Rob and I could testify, being in these roles as pastors, that it's shocking to us how paralyzing fear and shame can be for people, and it becomes a big obstacle or a roadblock to people's spiritual walk. I mean, we are people of the way. We follow in the way of Jesus, and whenever those obstacles creep in, those infidels of the heart, it really paralyzes the whole walk. So share with us your own wisdom on staying focused and overcoming fear and shame and when these things creep in.
Yeah. what strikes me about that chapter is how, that what comes from that chapter is how our spiritual journey or life or even a time of worship is never never in ideal circumstances. Like you would have thought that after reaching Jerusalem finally, the pilgrims would have had this beautiful experience, but no, even there they did not, because the whole Holy Land was controlled by the Egyptian and Mamluk sultans. And so they were always negotiating, like you said, this contested territory. So that really surprised me.
Or sneaking in, right? Like, I mean, it was Felix that,
Yes. He
sort
did.
of, I sort of, as I read that part, I thought I'd like to have this guy downtown with me on a Friday night. I feel like he could get us into any pub at any time, even if there's a line. Because I feel like Felix seems very industrious. It's like if there's a place he needs to be, there is no obstacle.
Felix Fabry, when he found some of the holy sites closed to him because they were now, maybe they were mosques, maybe they had been torn down, but they were just not available anymore for the Christian pilgrims. Sometimes he just snuck in anyway, sort of after hours, or he would bribe the officials guarding them, like all kinds of things. So he just kind of did go where he wanted. It's one of the other really funny, amusing stories about Felix. But that surprised me about medieval pilgrimage, that even when they supposedly like arrived, it was still not ideal circumstances. And so, for us, even something as simple as going to church, it's a time set aside for worship. There doesn't need to really be anything else that you're thinking about. It's a set aside like sacred time. And I can't tell you like how many times I have gone to church, totally not wanting to be there. My heart.
Here's a confession from a couple of priests. We've had times when we didn't want to be there either.
My heart is not where it needs to be. I have trouble worshiping. Even in this special time that's set aside. And in the book, I talk about these as our internal enemies, because I know that in our quest, on our spiritual quest, things come along to make it not ideal or to make it difficult, obstacles, roadblocks. And I know that for many Christians around the globe, there are real enemies and obstacles out there. For me, the starting point for me is always the enemy within, which I have enough trouble with. So we mentioned you mentioned fear and shame, and Walter Hilton, the Augustinian canon we talked about earlier, he writes about these as he sort of personifies them and says fear and shame come up to you and whisper in your ear that you're never going to make it, and they will try to convince you to turn back. So it's fascinating to me how he gives them these personalities that really try to reason with you and convince you to turn back. And when I speak of shame, mostly in this context, I'm speaking of the feeling that none of us, that maybe we're not worthy. Like we don't deserve the love of God. I'm ashamed, and God will never love me. That kind of shame. That I don't even deserve to get to Jerusalem. And for me, being aware of these enemies is helpful. And one thing that I think I mentioned in that chapter is, again, something like Hilton's mantra, where he says, when you're tempted by these internal enemies, you have to stand up to them and kind of remind yourself that I am nothing, I have nothing, I desire nothing but the love of Jesus. And that's that mantra again. So I guess so many of the helpful things are always taking the focus off self and training it on Jesus, sort of reminding yourself that he is, our center and the reason we're making the journey. So
Exactly.
I found that whole conversation actually reminded me of C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters. Just because, that little treatise, that little book sort of points out how insidious things like fear and shame and so on are in community, in relationships and all that. And you've got these letters from a junior devil to a senior devil, or a senior devil to, trying to get advice on how do I maximize the potential of fear and shame and guilt and all these things, right? And so I found that you're writing about that evoked that memory of me of that book, that it's just so easy to spiral into that rabbit hole where everything we fear most about ourselves becomes magnified, and it's like, to me, the enemy wins when we do that. So
yeah, I had not noticed that parallel with what C.S. Lewis did in the Screwtape Letters, but you're right.
Yeah,
Something about personifying them,
yeah,
makes them kind of especially terrifying.
yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, again, Lisa, you mentioned, we have that destination or that hope and vision to reach Jesus, to reach our holy Jerusalem. I want to finish up by talking about being reborn and this idea that, for all of us, the hope and desire to have that experience of Jesus, that experience of God, is so powerful for us. Medieval pilgrims, when they reached the holy city, described having incredible spiritual experiences. And one who arrived more than ready to meet with Jesus was English mystic Marjorie Kemp. And Marjorie, who had lost her traveling companions on the way, braved the Alps alone. She waited 13 weeks to cross the sea. Her experience in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre more than made up for her troubles, though, along the way. And during one of the nights of her lock-in with Jesus, Marjorie had a vision that deepened her faith. Can you tell us more about that experience of hers, and maybe perhaps in that, offer words on what that might mean for us, those who follow Jesus today, as we explore how and where we encounter Jesus on our own pilgrimage? And it doesn't necessarily have to be all the way over in Jerusalem. It could be in a chapel. It could be in the everydayness of our kitchens or our workplaces or at the gym or wherever it might be. But could you share a little bit about that, about Marjorie?
Well, before you do, I just want to say I will never find Jesus at the gym.
No, and he will never find you there
because I would have to go to the gym to find Jesus at the gym. I'm just saying, I find that offensive that you threw that in. But anyway,
I was thinking of you, buddy. I was thinking of you.
Go ahead, Lisa. Sorry.
No. Marjorie Kemp was early 15th century pilgrim, and so she did have this incredibly difficult, kind of fraught journey where she fought constantly with her traveling companions, who occasionally kicked her out of the group, crossed the Alps without her traveling companions, with a guide, but still kind of alone, had to wait 13 weeks in Venice before her galley sailed. Okay, so finally got to Jerusalem. And Marjorie Kemp is a bit of a character and a controversial figure today. But she writes in her kind of autobiography, the book about her life, that when she finally made it into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, where pilgrims would often spend 3 nights locked inside the church, that she, kneeling before the place where the cross had been, that she had a vision of Jesus on the cross before her, and that she fell to the ground sobbing. And that from then on had the gift of tears and a rebirth of compassion, sort of, I guess, maybe a renewal of faith, we could call it. And so I called that chapter Being Reborn. So for us, I don't think being reborn means necessarily like a vision, a dramatic visionary experience like some of the mystics had. And it's not, or doesn't have to be the like a one-time experience either. Like I was reborn.
Are you saved? I got saved on Saturday and I'm good forever.
Yeah. I think we can think of reaching our destination and experiencing a renewal or rebirth of our faith in different ways. And so we've talked about the lifelong journey of faith, that we are headed toward the heavenly Jerusalem. So like our whole life is this journey there, and we're not there yet. But even before then, we take other journeys, maybe to little Jerusalems. And one of them might be, for example, the journey of prayer. That seems like an obvious one, but several, at least a couple medieval theologians, and one of them being St. Augustine, writes about prayer as a kind of interior journey. And St. Bonaventure, the Franciscan, is another one who does this, where you kind of retreat from the outer world and go deep within. And St. Bonaventure actually calls it reaching the interior Jerusalem, where Jesus is, so that you're in prayer, kind of like going into the Holy Sepulchre, maybe. You're going away from the world into an enclosed space where you can be with Jesus, so that kind of experience of Jesus is like a pilgrimage, and where we can find renewal of our heart. And throughout history, a number of like contemplative folk, like monks and nuns and mystics, also talk about encountering Jesus as sort of an approach to life in a way. And what I mean is that we want to draw near to Jesus and to experience him in some way, okay? Meaning that we don't want to just study about Jesus or the Bible, or have a lot of knowledge, but to really draw near to him in a more experiential way. That's an important part of our faith. And that approaching our faith, like that, a desire for Jesus and for wanting to draw near, is a way that we can encounter or experience him, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that what strikes me about that is that I think and again, this may be a function of it being, a cradle Anglican, I don't know, but I feel like a lot of times for us, faith is a head experience.
Right.
And the most profound times in my own walk on the way have been where the experience has been completely other than intellectual, or that has been experiential and beyond words, numinous, if you will, or whatever. And so trying to find that space within the church and having these spiritual conversations on a book like this is just incredibly helpful.
Yeah, good. Well, so right, maybe our experience beyond words is prayer. Sitting with Jesus. No words are really even necessary, but there can be words. Maybe it's looking at a painting, or just kind of sitting quietly in meditation. It could be any number of things. And that is important to me because, like you mentioned, Kevin, I was brought up as a head person, I guess, student and academic, mastery, knowledge. But we're never going to master God or Jesus or even our faith. And so I feel like approaching him in this way sometimes just, I don't know, without words, with a heart experience.
And I think that thing about revisiting the medieval mystics and pilgrims and so on is good, because I think a lot of what we struggle with is our postmodern brains, right? Which is we've lost something. We've lost the imagination. We've lost the storytelling in the sense of being able to enter into the story without having to have some logical explanation about everything. Like, we miss all of that. And you hear it, like you said, music is a good example. Ian here is a budding songwriter. And if you listen to Ian's music, he's not the most religious dude you'll ever meet, but if you listen to what he writes in his words, there's a profound spirituality in there, because I believe a great part of who he is coming out in his art.
Great example.
Right. And the term that was coming to mind talking about this was thin spaces. I think it was Marcus Borg, the first time I ever read a book of Marcus Borg's years ago, and he was talking about thin spaces where the heavenly and the earthly just kind of touch, right? They just touch for a second. And in that thin space, you have that experience, or that, whatever you want to call it. It's not a head thing.
Right.
And those little things like that are important to be mindful of.
I think it's what all of us yearn for.
Yes, true. Yeah, to be in those, Well, this has been a great opportunity to chat. Lisa, thanks so much. Lisa Deam is our guest today. Her book, again, is titled 3,000 Miles to Jesus, Pilgrimage as a Way of Life for Spiritual Seekers. Again, folks, if you're looking for something a little extra to pick up for the Lenten season, definitely pick that up. It's a perfect companion for you on your Lenten journey. Wherever you may be.
4,828 kilometers to Jesus.
That's right. That's right. Lisa, we can't thank you enough for spending the time with us and being part of the Vickers Crossing.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Great. Thanks again, Lisa, for dropping by. We appreciate you spending the time. We appreciate the book, and we hope more people will be able to pick this up. And always nice to know that there's an opportunity to have that kind of Lenten reflection book that we could share in book studies or with friends or whatever. It's always good to have a nice list of those to go to. And I think this can be one of them for your library.
Yep, she's written a great book, and it's very accessible, folks. I mean, it's not sort of dense or any of that. I just really encourage you to pick it up.
Well, that's great. Thanks to everybody for dropping by. Thanks to our sponsors, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Our thanks to Bishop Todd and the Diocese of Huron for supporting us, and of course to Molly Maid, where you can make your home a healthy haven and call Molly Maid London today. I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
He is Rob Henderson, and I'm Kevin George, and I'm from St. Aidan's Church.
Never been to a gym.
Henderson. That is Kevin George. And my name is Ian. Thank you all for listening.
And you're right. You will not find me at the gym.
And Kevin won't be at the gym. But if you are out and about, my friend, I always have to remind you to always look both ways.
Before you cross the street.
Oh, yeah.
To the gym.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!